My name is Einar Asgaard. I work as a curator at the Odense City Museum, the Hans Christian Andersen Museum, and right now we are sitting in the street next to the house where Hans Christian Andersen was born in 1805. When Hans Christian Andersen wrote The Little Mermaid, he felt quite proud because he had installed his own emotional view of the world into the story.
Hans Christian Andersen said that of all the stories he wrote, The Little Mermaid was the one that really moved him in the course of the writing. I think it was really emotional for him, probably because the life of the Little Mermaid in many ways related to his own life and his own experiences.
There's no doubt that Hans Christian Andersen saw a part of himself in the picture of The Little Mermaid. The Little Mermaid is a story of going from one level to another level. And that is actually the story of Hans Christian Andersen.
As we started developing the story for a Disney animated feature, I was really impressed with just how visual it was and how cinematic it was.
The imagery in it is so powerful and poetic, and Andersen, he seemed sort of like a filmmaker in the way he was describing the story, and it really made the story come alive.
We wondered why Disney had never pursued it before. It wasn't actually until months later that we found out that the story had been developed in the early 1940s by Walt Disney and his staff as a kind of a featurette.
Kai Nielsen, the great illustrator of children's books, had done a whole version of the story in these little watercolors and charcoals. They had these drawings stored away in the archives from that version, and they were a great inspiration to us as we unearthed them and literally pinned them to storyboards and used them, particularly in the storm sequence, I'd say, as a point of visual reference.
One of the strongest themes, I think, of Andersen's story is this theme of yearning for a world that you are not a part of.
When Andersen was born, Odense was a small city. Hans Christian Andersen's parents were absolutely poor. But in Odense there was a theater, and Andersen, he had a longing to this theater and the theater life. When Hans Christian Andersen was 14 years old, he decided to leave Odense in order to get to Copenhagen and search for a career at the Royal Theatre there.
He aspired to be famous, to be successful, to be accepted, to be loved, all those things.
When Hans Christian Andersen published his first fairy tales, his old friend told him that fairy tales would make him immortal. This is the wish of the Little Mermaid.
In Andersen's version of The Little Mermaid, she had almost a dual motivation. She was intrigued by the human world and particularly by this prince, but also she aspired to have an immortal soul.
But in order to gain an immortal soul, she has to be loved by someone.
In our version, the immortal soul idea seemed less important.
It was a love at first sight story, so I think as Walt's version did, we also did, in that we focused her attention really on this prince. One of the big set pieces in the Andersen story is really this rescue of the prince. In the Andersen story, there is a convent on this sort of cliff above the beach, and there are girls from the convent that then come upon the prince, and that scares the mermaid. She dives off into the water, and one of the girls from the convent is the person that he really feels like is the one that saved his life. In the 1941 version, Kai Nielsen and the story guys at the time were really trying to stay closer to the Andersen story, and Walt's big note was like, we don't need to do Andersen literally. We need to adapt this and make it work for our medium. He thought it would be stronger if she's leaning over him and she's humming a song and he's just sort of groggily waking up.
And I could be part of your world.
He hears the song, he catches a slight glimpse of her. She was a mystery girl that he could only just remember this kind of haunting refrain that would play through the course of the film, and that was in Walt's notes. We hadn't seen those when we developed the story, but we actually went right along those same lines, that it was really the voice that sort of haunts him.
So it was as if Walt was looking over our shoulders while we were developing this, because it seemed like a lot of the things that he was thinking, we were thinking too.
Up where they walk, up where they run, up where they stay all day in the sun.
singing voice. It's also a parallel between Hans Christian Andersen and The Little Mermaid, because Andersen had a very brilliant singing voice as a child. He became a pupil at the singing school to the Royal Theatre. Later on, he began acting for the theatre. But after 3 years, he was dismissed from service. He was too tall, too skinny, and his singing voice was changing while he was growing older.
What I want from you is your voice.
The Sea Witch was a character in the Andersen version, but she was a smaller part of the story. She does strike a bargain with the Little Mermaid, and the price is her voice, and she literally cuts off her tongue. In the 1941 version that Walt and his story people came up with, she, in her excitement about becoming human, rushed off to land without knowing the consequences of her deal with the witch. And it wasn't until she actually opened her mouth to speak to this prince that she discovered that her voice was the price she had paid. We wanted to keep the Andersen thing that she knew that she was giving up her voice, and we didn't want to have the bloodiness of actually seeing a tongue cut off, so we did sort of a magical version of all that.
Certainly one of the big themes in Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid is this idea of self-sacrifice and what you have to go through, what you have to give up for love. She has to give up so much that you really feel for her and what she's going through. In the Hans Christian Andersen version, even though she gets these beautiful legs, it's painful to walk on them. And I think this certainly relates to Hans Christian Andersen himself.
The pain of love that the Little Mermaid suffers was a pain that Andersen suffered throughout his life. When Hans Christian Andersen wrote The Little Mermaid, he was 32 years old, and he had 2 love experiences, but unhappy love experiences. Although Hans Christian Andersen climbed the social ladders and got his education, he was a sort of misfit in Copenhagen. His love was disregarded because Hans Christian Andersen was a full-time author and he was very poor. He did not belong to the elite of society. The same thing is going on in the fairy tale of the Little Mermaid. She cannot say to the prince what she feels. She had to be silenced with her love.
In the Hans Christian Andersen version of the story, when the voiceless mermaid washes up on land and she's found by the prince, she lives there in the palace for quite a long time. So even though she's well treated, she has to go through so much suffering as the prince tells her that you are so great and I like you so much. I really would love to marry someone just like you, but you're not the girl who saved my life and I must marry the girl who saved my life.
In the 1941 version, when she came to shore, she heard the bells in the church and she was led immediately to this wedding of the prince with this girl. The wedding is taking place and she's heartbroken as she sees the ship going off and she's seeing her dreams of her life with the prince going away. In our version, we wanted to have a ticking clock.
Before the sun sets on the 3rd day, you've got to get dear old Princey to fall in love with you.
So we had time to have them have a tour of the kingdom and get to know each other. And he could really be drawn to her over the course of those 3 days, and yet there was sort of a deadline involved.
And then we took the idea then to actually have the prince finally decide, forget this mystery girl. I really like this mute girl that I met on the beach. In terms of the other woman in these 3 versions of the story, in Andersen's version, there's kind of a prearranged marriage, and to his surprise, he discovers she is in fact this girl from the convent. So everything works out very happy for the prince, not so happy for the mermaid. She knows that at the next sunrise, this is going to bring about her death, and she's going to turn into sea foam.
In our version then, we made this other maiden be the witch who had actually taken the mermaid's voice. So there's this horrible irony that, you know, he's not only getting married, but he's getting married to the person that we despise the most.
In the Disney version in the 40s, he really felt it wasn't important who the prince was going to marry as long as it wasn't the mermaid, and that's the way they played it.
In the Hans Christian Andersen ending of the story, the Little Mermaid is turned into sea foam and she is whisked away by the daughters of the air.
So she dies, but because of the acts of love, she can gain immortal life. The success of the Little Mermaid is that she is gaining the immortal soul. And the tragedy of the Little Mermaid is, in fact, the tragedy of Hans Christian Andersen's life. Because in contrast to his splendid career as an author, there is this tragic life of a person who could not get the love and had to spend his life in loneliness.
The actual Disney version, explored in the 40s, was even sadder than the Andersons version because she totally died and turned into sea foam and she was gone. Our version, in terms of the climax, is probably where we departed from Andersen the most radically. The Sea King finally realizing that his love for his daughter overpowers everything else, transforms her into a human so that she can marry her prince. There's still a price to be paid. The king has to give up his daughter and Ariel has to give up her family. So there is a bittersweet aspect, and I think in that respect, hopefully it would be something that Hans Christian Andersen could relate to.